Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Local Development Plan Advisory Committee. I'm Councillor Paul Conlon. I'll be chairing the meeting. We have a number of speakers this evening. We'll get onto those shortly. But before then, we'll go through the formalities at the start of the meeting. So first of all, on the agenda, apologies for absence and substitutions. I don't believe there are any substitutions. I don't think we've had any apologies for absence either, have we?
No, that's correct, Chair. No
okay, that's correct, as everybody does seem to be here, so can't see any reason why anyone would apologise for absence. Urgent matters. I've not been advised of any urgent matters. So we'll move on to declarations of interest. Does anyone have any declarations, any interests that they wish to declare? Please sort of shout out or indicate if you wish to declare anything. If not, I can't see or hear anything, so I assume there's no declarations of interest. Matters to be considered in private. Well, I haven't had any, been advised of any matters to be considered in private either. So there don't seem to be any of those. Okay, so then minutes of the previous meetings. We have two sets of minutes to consider at this meeting. The minutes of the meetings held on 23rd November and the last meeting, the previous meeting that was held on 16th of December. So first of all, the meetings held on 23rd of November. Has anybody got any matters to raise on those minutes? So please sort of shout out or try and attract my attention if you've got anything to raise, any question that you want to raise on those. Okay. Is that, were you sort of putting your hand
to wave there for, yeah. Just a
okay. Yeah,
just a quick one, just in terms of, sorry if I've missed it, which is always strongly possible, but I think the team were going to start putting some of the materials, and particularly ones that are well drafted, you know, well, obviously the tall building stuff, the design review guides, the early drafts of the character studies, etc. I thought they were going to put them in a public place so that generally the community could start seeing and feeding back on them. Forgive me if I've missed it, but if I don't know if it is up. And then if it is up, my second question would be, how can we make sure that it's publicised so that people can start to comment on it?
Okay, good question. I don't know either because I've not looked at the website recently. Is one of the officers able to give us on an update on what's happening? Yep.
Chair, yes, I can. Yes, so yesterday.
Hello, Steve. Yes, go ahead. Yep.
Hi there. So thank you very much, Chair. So yesterday we published the housing design guide, the character study, alongside the tall buildings position statement. Next week there will be a whole other raft of other documents going up, and on the 3rd of February we'll also be publishing for consultation, in fact, the draft conservation area appraisals and management plans. There's also a scoping report for the integrated impact assessment, if you remember that from a couple of meetings back. That's the very technical study which we're required to produce before Reg 18 in the summer, which sets out how we will go about that process. That deals with issues around sustainability, appraisal, social inclusion, equalities, etc. And that also went live yesterday. What I will do, Chair, because it does seem that some councillors have got this, but not all, I will arrange for the newsletter that went out yesterday to be sent to all members of the committee, just to make sure you've got those links and to make sure you're added to the mailing list.
Oh, okay.
Steve, Paul, can I just come back very, very quickly?
Yes.
Just
okay.
say, Steve, that's fantastic, and that's really great news. Just it would be really great because it is good and it'll start to feel real to the public and to all those people out there, the residents. Could we have a bit of, maybe have someone from comms next time, which might be our last time, I know, to actually really start talking about how we actually make sure people know this is there and that we really want their engagement. There's a bit of that, but not perhaps enough. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, okay, good point, Linda. Yeah. Okay, I've got Libby Camp, so Libby.
Yeah, can we make sure that they're all in the one place under a heading called local plan? Because then it would be really easy for people like myself and the public to find them rather than all over the place with a heading called local plan where they're all stacked.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, is there such a place like that, or are they more difficult to find?
Other councils do it that way. You just search in local plan, it comes up with a page, and then they step down from there, from the one front sheet.
Well, yeah,
Chair?
I mean, it seems logical to do it like that, but Steve, yeah, go ahead.
Chair, that's how it's done. So if you go to our local plans landing page, which you'll find off of the planning and building control landing page.
Sorry, Steve, can I just stop you? If I go into the council website and I type in local plan, will that take me to the right place?
It should do. In fact, if you just put it into a Google search engine, I tried it myself last night just to make sure it did work.
Great.
It does. And then from that landing page, you'll see a variety of other links which will take you to other documents. So it will take you to documents which are part of our current development plan, including the London plan. But probably the key folder at this stage is probably the folder called evidence base. Now I'm just in the process of revamping that because there's some old material up there which I want to take down to avoid confusion, and we're replacing that with newer material, but that will be the placeholder for all the various reports. Now you will quickly find that there will be quite an accumulation of information, so we've put those into subfolders. But if you click on local plans, then go to evidence space, you'll then see the range of folders: climate change, design, etc. Click on that one, it will then take you to the relevant subsection.
Okay, so I now know to go for evidence space, but I bet my neighbour doesn't. It's
well,
not, it's just not user friendly for ordinary people like us who wouldn't think to look under evidence space. Can you think of a better term for it or something like that? It's just, we have to let the people know, and they would never think of looking under evidence space. It's got to be something a bit more simple for us, because we wouldn't think to look under evidence space.
That's a fair point, but obviously I've got to think of the technical aspects as well, and that's the reason why we've produced a newsletter. So just very briefly, Chair, if you'll indulge me, we've had now almost 7,500 responses to our Shaping Ealing survey, which we launched at the end of November last year, and that's harvested 4,500 separate email addresses. So the newsletter that was issued yesterday went out to everybody who contacted us and responded to the Shaping Ealing survey. So that's really, really good news. And on the Shaping Ealing newsletter, there are links which will take you directly to the page. You won't even have to go through the steps I've just described. If you're interested in, for example, the housing design guide, you click on the link, it will take you directly to the page where the design guide is located. And that will be the formula we'll be using going forward. Right. And we'll be using the newsletter as a way of highlighting any new pieces of evidence that we publish over the coming months.
That's great.
Okay, thanks for that update, Steve. So yeah, if you can send that newsletter out to the rest of the councillors, because I don't think I had a copy. So yeah, I'd like to have a look at it, and I'm sure the other members of the committee would. And then people can have a look at that page on the website and have a look at those documents for themselves. So okay, before we move on, are there any other points on these minutes? Okay, if not, okay, I'll move on to the next.
Hello. Hello. I'm sorry, Councillor Colin. I thought we were talking about the November meeting, and I did ask to have a word, if I may, matters arise.
Yes, we are still talking about the November meeting. Well, I am just about to move on to the December one.
Sorry.
So, yeah, okay, you're just jumping a bit ahead of me there, but yes, okay.
Apologies.
So the meeting on 16th of December. So does anyone have any points to raise on those? So you do, Will, I know. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for questioning your ordering that. It was, and thank you for the opportunity to raise it. It was picking up on what I said. You recall last time I did give a list of documents that need to be on the website. They're statutorily required as part of the local planning process. If you remember, I gave a presentation which I've circulated to members now of what I said. And at that meeting, and it's minuted here, Councillor Munro said that it wasn't the place for me to be raising that, but I would be written to on that regard. And I haven't actually received a response to what I said, and I'd be grateful to have that response. And if it is the wrong place to be raising issues of that nature, I think it would be helpful to me and others to know where we might do that, because they are important. And just to pick up a bit, follow on from what we've just discussed, I do want to say that maybe it is now going to be sorted out, and I'm grateful to Steve Barton for saying that, but still the evidence base is not clearly found. I went on it last night. I did come across the housing design guide and the characterization study, but it didn't seem to be very easy to find. I would like to suggest looking at one or two other boroughs for the way they present their information, because it is quite, I was looking, for instance, at Camden, and it's very intuitive there, and I think it might be helpful to refer to that and maybe steal their methodology. Thank you. But follow up on what I said, and this is for the local development scheme, the authorities monitoring report, the statement of community involvement, and where the evidence base is. I would be grateful to be told when that will appear. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Will. Okay, has anyone got an update that they can give Will on where we are with those documents? Okay, do we have any dates when we think they will be finally be available?
Sorry, my apologies. I was on mute there. I was talking to myself.
Yeah. Sorry,
it's bound to happen at some point. No, my apologies. I was just saying, thanks, Will, for the suggestion. I will have a look at that as an exemplar. I am looking at the web pages to get things in order, and we will try and make it as intuitive as possible. That's the reason why we're going down the newsletter route. So those people who've registered, and particularly like Will, are very interested in the work that we're doing, can be taken to updates, because obviously, you know, even if the website is in order, and I know we've got to do an awful lot better than we have at the moment, you still need to know when we're uploading new material so that you're aware of stuff as it's published. An awful lot is going to start to filter through in the coming months. I have to say, I apologize if I've missed an action on my part to provide a written response to Will. I must have missed that in the minutes. I can't see it, but I thought I had provided the update at our last meeting. But just to say, on the particular point of the LDS and the SCI, they are both on my desk at the moment. I'm almost finished with the SCI, so that should be published shortly. So watch this space for the next newsletter, which will be going out on the 3rd of February. So you may well see some good news. On the LDS, I mean, the key issue there, you're quite right, it is a statutory document, but in terms of our intention to go out to Reg 18 consultation, we've made that very, very clear. That will be happening during the summer. I'm in the process of just agreeing, subject to conversations with our comms team and with my legal advisors, the exact date, so we can be precise in terms of when that will happen. It will depend on when bits of evidence are ready, and when we can then reflect that in the draft of the plan, which I'm yet to write, you may be surprised to learn. So there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment in the background, and I don't want to make a promise about a date for publication, which we then don't miss, because we will be one of the first people to call me out. Okay,
thanks, Steve. I think Will was actually, well, I'm putting him on the spot a bit here if he's here, but I think it was Councillor Munro that promised to give Will a reply. I don't know if he's listening.
Sorry, I've just rejoined. I had a phone call. So
Oh,
what am
okay.
I supposed to reply to?
Well, Will French was chasing you up after the last meeting where he, if you remember, he raised a number of points. And you said it wasn't really the right place to discuss them, but you would sort of write to him and respond
Did
to.
we not have? I think we had a conversation. We had a conversation and we talked them through. If I remember rightly. No, Will?
No, I was asking about the local development scheme, the authorities monitoring report, the STEM and community involvement, and the evidence base, and where that was going to be found. And that was what I was trying to say. I don't believe I've had a reply to that. These are statutory required, and there's a member of the public who's not totally sort of engaged, as I know all you are. It's very, but it's going to have an impact on us, and the public, people like me, do want to know what's going on. We do feel outside, and I think in all fairness, we do need to be kept in the loop and up to speed, and that's what I was asking for.
Okay. It is difficult because I'm reliant on officers and they are working as quickly as possible to deliver all those statutory requirements. But we did do an interim report. So I did force the officers' hands, me and Peter, and we went through to force the hands to do an interim report and delivered as much as we could at the time. Now, yes, there is the Ombudsman's findings that we should have done it earlier, and we are trying to meet that. But we're not in a position, but we are working very, very hard, and Steve is here, but they are working as hard as they can and as fast as they can to actually deliver what you're looking for. But I can't give you a time at the moment.
Okay, are you happy, Will, that kind of, as far as we're able to answer it?
I think this will, when this comes to examination, the examiner will ask to see all the publicity and the consultation documentation that's going around. So this will impinge on the progress of the local plan. Now, I don't want to interfere and delay the local plan. But if the necessary requirements aren't being met, that is what is at risk. And it needs to be followed. It is a requirement.
I understand clearly, but officers are telling me that we will have them in time for the Reg 18 proper consultation.
Yes, I don't think anyone's saying we're not going to do them. It's just that we're not giving exact dates when they will be available, but before the Reg 18.
But they're required now. They are required now, and not just before the Reg 18. I mean, this is. It's a public exercise. It's not an exercise just by the council. It's an exercise that's going to impact upon the public as a whole, and they have a right to be kept informed about it. And we're just slipping further and further down the line, and it will raise risks about the overall progress of the local plan. That is I'm sure Steve and Sam will confirm that.
Steve, do you have anything to say? Because my understanding is we will meet the requirements.
We certainly will. We will have to. Otherwise, we won't be found sound or legally compliant when we get to examination. So in that respect, Will is correct. But in terms of the AMR, which, sorry, we're sort of jumping around between different local development plan documents here. I mean, the good news is that we have been waiting for a raft of data from City Hall. It's been a source of great frustration for me, the team, and for Councillor Manro as my portfolio holder. And we have now finally managed to receive much of the information that we've been waiting now for several months. So the team is now busily engaged on analysing that and putting that into the correct formulation. And the two documents that are missing in relation to the AMR, because we have published, as Councillor Manro has said, a very comprehensive, very detailed AMR for all of the outstanding period in question. What is missing is, though, still fundamentally important and a crucial piece of evidence. It is the housing trajectory, an up-to-date housing trajectory, and the 5-year land supply. I'll stick my neck out and hope that if not by the next LDAP meeting, or certainly the one afterwards, we may have some good news to report. But I can't give you an exact date because we're still ploughing through the figures, and it's a massive exercise. And I would just point out to Will, the size of my team the last time we produced a local plan is roughly half the size today than it was 10 years ago. That's just reflecting the economic reality of cutbacks in local government. And I have to say, I would not suggest that productivity is enhanced by home working. So I'm actually quite thrilled at the prospect of possibly getting back into the office, which will make communication and so forth so much easier.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Well, I think we have covered that point. I mean, we do. I mean, I know the progress is not as got as far as you would like, Will, but I think we do understand the importance of producing those documents. So, hopefully they will all be available, well before the start of the Regulation 18 consultation. Okay. Okay, so we're still on the minutes of the December 16th meeting. Does anyone else have any points on those minutes? So please shout or wave or whatever.
Sure, we are collectively agreed to all the rest of the minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to take what Councillor Mahmood said as agreement to the minutes, unless someone else speaks up quickly, and nobody is. So, okay, so thanks very much, everyone. So that's those minutes approved as well. Okay, so on to the main business of the meeting, which is the local development plan update and the speakers we have this meeting. So I think Sam Cuthbert from planning is about to start us off. So Sam, if I could hand over to you, and if you could explain what you're going to talk about, and could introduce the two guest speakers that we have that will be speaking after you, and then we'll start your presentation.
Great, thank you, Chair. So there are three different presentations this evening. I will go first with a presentation on the Employment Land Review update, and then the expectation is we'll have Will Temple speaking from PRD on the Inclusive Growth Study, which is currently underway to inform the local plan. And finally, Nico Bazzetti from the Centre for London will talk about the Industrial Land Commission, which Ealing has been participating in. I've asked speakers to keep to about 15 minutes each, and I'll endeavour to do that myself as well. And the suggestion is, if you agree, Chair, that we take specific questions or clarifications after each speaker, but that there is a discussion at the end to discuss any substantive issues.
Yes, I'd like to do that. Yes, if there are any questions that are very specific to a particular presentation, yeah, we'll take them immediately after the presentation. But I'd like to have most of the questions at the end of the meeting, when we can have, all of the speakers commenting on them, as we did that at the last meeting, and it seemed to work quite well. So I'd like to follow that sort of template tonight as well. So okay, back to you then, Sam.
Great, thank you, Chair. I will fiddle around with the slide presentation, and if you let me know when that's come up, I will start. Can you see that, Chair?
Yes, I can see the presentation. Yep. Great,
thank you. As I said, I will introduce the theme of the meeting this evening, which is the overall employment, the overall economic evidence of the plan, and I'll also talk specifically to one component of that, which is the Employment Land Review. So local plans in general are supported by one chief study, which is the Employment Land Review, which deals mainly with the demand and supply for industrial land rather than any other topic. In addition to that, retail and office demand and supply are typically dealt with other studies. And in Ealing's case, we have a retail needs study, the last component of which was completed in 2018. And we also have the London Office Policy Review, which was completed in 2017. Both of those areas of economic evidence are subject to what I would characterize as exaggerated uncertainty due to COVID, which is to say not just that the economic situation has deteriorated and that there's uncertainty about future investment, but rather that both retail and office have faced substantial challenges to their fundamental business models. And as most people know, as a result of things like home working and increasing shift to home delivery during the pandemic. And so I'll discuss more how we envisage dealing with that. Also, it's worth pointing out that aviation, of course, has seen in some ways the most severe challenges to its business model during the pandemic. And in relation to the borough, that obviously affects Heathrow, which is a key employer. That's something that we will be considering more generally, both through the work on the local plan, but also through joint work with the Heathrow Spatial Planning Group, of which the council is a participant. In addition to the uncertainty around the economy of retail, there have been particular shifts on a national level in policy, particularly the creation of the new E-use class, which incorporates both most town centre uses and also light industrial uses. So quite a significant change in the fundamental underpinnings of the planning system. And the proposal is to address that component of economic evidence through a joint piece of work with our West London Alliance partners. And that piece of work is being spec'd at the moment, but we don't currently have any results to share at this meeting. Therefore, coming back to the ELR, we do have a study that was done in 2019. In the general run of things, we regard that as being reasonably up to date, possibly something we would look at doing a small technical update to prior to the examination. But we also have this background of substantial uncertainty, not only in economic outlook, but also a variety of economic models of great significance to the borough. The proposal, therefore, is for our main economic evidence base to comprise the ELR update, which I'll come on to in a moment, a specific dedicated inclusive growth study, which Will Temple from PRD will speak to shortly, which is essentially designed to address the types of growth, the types of demand that are identified in the ELR, and indeed the supply of land that's available to meet those, but to address those from the point of view of the broader social and economic demands of the plan, the broader objectives of the plan. And finally, we have been very pleased to be able to participate in the Industrial Land Commission, which is being led by the Centre for London. And Nico Bozzetti will speak to that. The intention of that study is to look more holistically, more generally at the nature of industrial functions in London and how those can be met, what demands are made on London's resource of industrial land and how those can be met in future. So turning briefly then to what Ealing's industrial supply is. Most people probably know it's split into three broad categories. The bulk of our designated land, which is SIL or strategic industrial land, that's shown on the map, and mainly in the north and west of the borough as the sort of dark mauve colour. Those are the borough's main supply of consolidated industrial sites. They include, of course, Park Royal, which is part of OPDC, the Old Oakham Park Royal Development Corporation's planning area. And they relate particularly to sort of classic antisocial uses and also to functions like logistics. In addition to that, we have locally significant industrial sites, which despite the different nomenclature are very much an equal part of the borough's industrial land supply. Those are concentrated primarily in the south of the borough, both in South Acton, a notable couple of sites in Hanwell, and then the rest of the supply located in Southall. Those sites are traditionally more flexible, often, in fact, more employment dense sites than the SIL. And we'll come into in a moment the possible differing approaches to their treatment in the plan. In addition to that, there's a great deal of non-designated sites, which obviously don't appear on the map, which are essentially any employment, any industrial or related use, particularly related to sui generis uses, located anywhere in the borough, which fall into the categories defined in policy. Looking then at the ELR, the borough has, as I mentioned before, an existing employment land review dating from 2019, which was a joint study with 4 of our West London neighbours. It reached a number of conclusions, most of which remain valid. Chiefly, it identified a broad shift from manufacturing demand and manufacturing uses toward primarily logistics and construction uses across the plan period. Overall, that equated to 1 hectare of net additional need, based on a growth of 22 hectares of mainly logistics and construction demand, and a decline of around 21 hectares of what is currently manufacturing space. That shouldn't be misunderstood in terms of total amount of demand. It implies something in the region of a 40 to 60 hectare requirement, particularly if that redevelopment is to take place on existing sites. And that's essentially because that development will require a restructuring of the borough's industrial supply from, as I say, those manufacturing uses, which are diminishing, to growth primarily in logistics and construction uses. The study also explicitly addressed viability, and it did identify an overall tension between this increased demand for the delivery of new industrial space, something which is exceptional in the borough's planning history, but also the necessary supporting uses and infrastructure to provide for those uses. We have, as I mentioned before, interim results on the review that we commissioned, the update rather that we commissioned of the ELR, and that broadly agrees with the conclusions of the original report. In particular, it points to diminished vacancy rates, a near historic low of around 3%, which is considerably below the roughly 9% that would be normal in any functioning land market, indicating sustained demand for that space. It also found that a lot of the borough's logistics need seems to have been brought forward. That is to say, not that the pandemic seems to have generated increased demand for logistics overall, but rather that it may have brought forward demand that was modelled to occur later in the plan period. It is also true that the study identified some uncertainty toward the end of its of the study period, which is in this case is 2041. I think that needs to be understood in the light of the broad uncertainty that we've seen, as I said at the beginning, in a number of different economic sectors. So turning then briefly to what that is likely to mean for Ealing's new local plan. Inclusive growth, as I said at the beginning, is one of the 3 main cross-cutting themes of the plan, along with health and climate action, which is to say it's one of the policies and one of the pieces of evidence that we expect to drive the whole approach of the plan to generate the outcomes that we are looking for in terms particularly of jobs and economic growth. Also, the Industrial Land Commission has identified, which our speaker will talk to in a moment, has identified a number of requirements for industrial land and for the management of that land, which go beyond the local plan process. So I think we need to understand that as an ongoing commitment for the borough and an ongoing strategic interest, but something also that will feed into and be reflected in the recommendations for the draft plan. Those recommendations, therefore, would include specific objectives for jobs and for GVA. It's not envisaged at the moment that the plan would identify any scope for industrial release, in that there is no evidence to support that, and is likely, therefore, that strategic industrial land would remain protected, that locally significant industrial sites, which I mentioned before, have a potentially different policy treatment identified for them in the London plan, that those may be recommended for mixed industrial or residential intensification, and that relates as much to the requirements for the type of industrial space to be provided as it does to any objective to deliver additional housing. It would be very much an industry-led approach, and that's something that Will may come on to in his presentation. And finally, reuse would be tested even on those non-designated sites that I mentioned. That's in line with the present local plan approach, but certainly we found no evidence that would support release of those sites without at least testing them for potential alternative industrial uses. Finally, it seems pretty clear that in relation to the industrial evidence we've seen, there will be a need to balance the quite voracious land demands of the logistics sector with both the broader social objective and environmental objectives of the plan, but also with other industrial sectors to include that to ensure that those aren't being crowded out by such a land-hungry main use. And finally, as I said near the beginning of the presentation, town centres and offices will need to be reassessed post-COVID. I think the open question at the moment is exactly which point at which we become post-COVID from the point of view of the new business models and new approaches that both the retail and the office sectors are clearly trying to develop at the moment, and will need to do so further in the future. So that is a brief, that's the end of the presentation, and a brief view of both the evidence that came forward in the ELR and also the other presentations that will expand on various aspects of that. So as I said, I think probably this is an opportunity for any clarification or any focused questions, but if you have any broader points of discussion, probably keep those for the panel session at the end. Chair, you're still on mute.
Yep, indeed I am. Okay, are there any questions for Sam at this stage? So please put either a virtual hand up or can't see any virtual hands, but otherwise just speak in the meeting. Okay. Doesn't look like there's unless I've missed.
Sorry, Chair. Can I just?
Councillor Munro. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in a little bit and just indicate that we are looking at this employment space, and we're not looking to release any, but it may be that we want to go a little bit further as the evidence comes forward to see whether we can increase the amount of employment space because of the administration's sort of determination to increase good jobs and create employment in the borough. So we may be wanting for us to look at through the local plan whether there is any need for us to actually increase the amount of employment space we may have in the borough as we work our way through this study. So I just wanted to outline that we were headed in the direction of actually protecting and maybe increasing, not in the direction of releasing industrial land.
Yes, that's exactly right, Councillor. And just to say that the evidence that would be necessary to support that will be undertaken as part of the local plan. Okay, that's great. Okay, well, Sam, if you'll introduce the next speaker, we'll move on to the next presentation then. Will Temple. Well, actually, I don't think I know your title at PRD, but in any case, just to give you a broad introduction, you can correct that when you speak. Will is part of the team at PRD who is carrying out the inclusive growth study, and as I said, the main objective of that is to try and provide, if you like, a social and economic aspect to what we've identified as a raw demand for a particular type of land use. So, Will, if you want to take off on that point. Okay, well, I can see the presentation, so looks like we're ready to start.
It's all working. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Fantastic, that's great. Well, just to answer your point, Sam, people call me various names at PRD, but I'll go by senior consultant today. And for those of you who are... For those of you who are wondering who PRD are, we are an economic development consultancy, sort of specialising in social and economic data to better understand places. So we do lots of work around sort of delivery strategies, around the economy and around asset strategies and that sort of thing. But we are supporting the Borough of Ealing on the Industrious Ealing Commission, which I'll talk to you a bit about today. So the Industrious Ealing Commission brings together two complementary strands of work, and one of which I'm going to focus a bit more on today because it's slightly more progressed than the other. The first is the inclusive growth baseline, and this is really, we've sort of framed it as evidence to inform action, and certainly evidence to inform the local plan, and to really understand the sort of socio-economic character of the borough, and in particular sort of the socio-economic character of the borough's 7 towns. And the second element of the study is a workspace audit. So it's looking at across all of the industrial space across the borough, looking at the sort of business demography in those areas, the employment breakdowns, to really sort of get under the skin of what's sort of driving some of the wider trends we're seeing through the data. So we're working on this commission with an organisation called We Made That, who are leading the workspace audit. So they're an architecture and urbanism practice. So they specialise in a lot of the more sort of qualitative data to get on the ground and speak to businesses and understand what's really sort of the key messages behind some of the data that we're seeing, and I'll talk you through today. So really, just to talk you through some of the priorities of the study, like I said, it's to understand the economy and the sort of contribution of the 7 sub-areas, but it's also to supplement the ELR to have a really sort of granular and in-depth understanding about industrial workspaces in the borough and how they're sort of contributing to the overall strategic vision that we want to put forward through the local plan, but also through wider council strategies as well. There's a key bullet point, the third one down there, is understand the impacts of COVID and Brexit. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that today in terms of what the emerging data is on that. But obviously that's sort of fundamental to shaping the economy that we want to see in Ealing going forward. But really, ultimately, what I'll present to you today is the sort of the emerging messages and sort of broad headlines on the social and economic data and how this is likely to frame the study going forwards. So just very quickly on our approach then, it's sort of a broad 3-stage approach that we're taking to this commission, and we're very much at the first stage of this at the moment. So it's probably an opportune time to speak to the committee today, because what we've effectively done is an initial sift of the available evidence that we can get on the borough's economy, on the contribution of industrial areas, and how that sort of all sort of comes together to some of the key messages affecting the borough's businesses and residents. So after this, and what we're moving towards over the next few months, is some on-the-ground testing. So We Made That, who I mentioned earlier, will be doing on-the-ground research, so complementing our quantitative analysis with some qualitative interviews of businesses to sort of really reveal some of the stories that the data can't tell us. And we'll be the first to say as an organisation that data doesn't have all the answers, and we do need to sort of supplement and augment the data that I'm presenting to you today with some proper conversations with businesses to understand what's really going on. And then the final stage, it will be recommendations, and some of this will feed into the local plan development, but also I think there'll be some wider recommendations around how the borough wants to sort of engage in the economy going forwards, because there's some quite fundamental things, as I'll go into talk about in a second. So Sam's covered a lot of this already, and we've talked about SIL and locally significant industrial sites, and the pink dots you can see on this map here. I'm sorry if it's not visible or you can't see certain bits of it. I will circulate the slides after this session. Is that industrial spaces are sort of littered throughout the borough, and this is mapping every single industrial postcode across Ealing. So one thing I wanted to reinforce as part of this is it's not just designated industrial land that's important to understanding industrial premises within Ealing. There's also a significant amount of industrial premises and industrial sites, if you like, within high streets and town centres. So the light blue area that you'll see there, it's just flashed up, is town centre boundaries as defined by the GLA. So as you can see, there's a lot of those pink dots fall within those town centre areas. And that really sort of heightens the case and the importance of understanding the role that these industrial spaces play in the function and the role of those town centres. And that's obviously a key element of this study going forwards. So you might ask why focus on industrial areas, and this might be quite an obvious question to answer based on what Sam's already said, based on the importance of these areas in terms of employment. But one thing to sort of reinforce is that these areas are arguably becoming more important for the borough as key areas of employment generation. And this is quite a busy map potentially, but I quite like the way it looks. I would say that having done it. But what you can see there is those areas over the last 5 years have become more intense in terms of employment for the borough. Therefore, they're increasing rapidly compared to a lot of other parts of the borough. Therefore, their sort of role becomes heightened in terms of their economic contribution to Ealing as a whole. The second reason why it's important to focus on this through this study, and I think hopefully we'll get to this place through the recommendations, is because of the sort of economic value that these areas play, not just to Ealing, but to London as a whole. There's a really important curatorial role that Ealing plays as a local authority in terms of shaping the economic activity that's going through there through the levers it has available to yourselves as a council. Obviously, one of those is the local plan, but there are other levers that you might want to explore that we'll sort of get onto when we get to the recommendations of this study. But ultimately, that land plays a really important role for addressing your wider employment objectives for Ealing as a borough. So just very quickly then, and aware that we've only got 15 minutes to get into this, but I just thought I'd walk you through some of the emerging messages from the data and what it's telling us so far. So just to start with the broader London context, I think everyone sort of knows London over the last decade or so has been a city of growth, and that's reflected in the business, employment and population metrics. Anyone you look at shows that London as a city is growing. But what we've sort of found as we've really sort of dug into the data and uncovered it is that, yes, it is a city of growth, but it's also a city of rising inequality, which the pandemic has ultimately brought to the fore. So the graph on the left shows pay-as-you-earn employment, i.e. the number of salaried employees in London, and it showed that during the pandemic, the number of salaried employees fell a lot more significantly than the UK as a whole. And this sort of uncovers a wider fragility in the London labour market, and we're increasingly finding that for many Londoners, the work just simply isn't paying for a lot of people. So the graph on the left shows the change in children living in absolute low-income households in London, and that shows that this has grown significantly since 2015, but all of that growth is children living in working families. So that's showing that those parents that are in those working families, that work just isn't paying a sufficient wage in order to live a secure and prosperous life. So factor two is the impact of COVID. As I was sort of saying, that these sort of underlying challenges have been exacerbated and exposed by the pandemic, and London was ultimately a lot more affected in terms of its labour market than any other region in the country. And ultimately, when we look at the Ealing data, Ealing hasn't been shielded from this. And ultimately, Ealing's been significantly impacted by the pandemic in terms of its labour market and its workforce, in terms of the claimant count, but also signs that there's potentially rising unemployment in the borough, sort of catalysed by the pandemic. So I think ultimately what we're sort of saying through this, that there's an opportune time to be doing this study with the sort of labour market fragility as it is, early signs of recovery from COVID, but understanding how we can sort of maximise the employment space within the borough to address some of these key fundamental challenges facing Ealing's economy. So the second factor I wanted to talk to you about, and this is more looking at the sort of business demographics within the borough and the quality of business and employment within the borough. And one of the more concerning metrics that we sort of looked at, and one that was quite startling to us, was the loss of higher value business activity from the borough. And I don't want to get involved in too much jargon in this presentation, because I feel like people in our sector are particularly bad for it. But I'm going to use the term the knowledge economy for this as a proxy for higher value employment. So the knowledge economy sort of encompasses a broad range of sectors and activities, ranging from sort of professional services to finance and insurance, all the way through to sort of digital activities and that sort of thing. It's a proxy for sort of higher value jobs. And what the data is sort of quite stark in showing is that all of those sort of high concentration of those businesses are all sort of located to the west of the borough, located around Ealing, Broadway and Acton. But actually, across every single sub area, across the 7 towns, it's fallen quite significantly over the last 5 years. So through the industrious Ealing strategy and through looking at industrial areas more generally, I think a key role of this commission would be to understand what's driving that and how we can address that through this study. So the fourth factor, Sam again has touched on this in terms of employment density. Certainly the designated industrial land in terms of SIL that we're seeing when we're looking at this is very low. So there's a feeling that this land should be working harder in order to really deliver some significant employment dividends for the borough. But as Sam suggested, in the sort of local SIL, so to the south of the borough, as you can see there in the southeast, in Acton and South Acton, actually some of those areas have some of the highest employment densities per hectare of anywhere in the borough, which is ultimately very interesting. Sam's already touched on vacancy, which suggests, again, there's a very low churn rate for a healthy sort of functioning industrial market. And the other thing we've also done is we've looked very closely at the sort of business breakdown of each of the individual designated industrial areas to look at how they differ in terms of business demographics, in terms of sector breakdown and that sort of stuff. And what we're seeing is the traditional SIL in the north of the borough is very sort of traditional in terms of what you'd expect with regards to industrial businesses there. So for example, there's a lot of wholesale, a lot of logistics companies, a lot of warehousing and that sort of activity. Whereas in the locally significant industrial sites, the economic activity is a lot more diverse, and we're actually seeing a lot more of that sort of higher value employment in those areas. So you've got a lot more financial and professional services, you've got a lot more ICT, media and creative services as well. And I think when we're sort of looking at low vacancy, we're also looking at challenges of rising rents, which the draft ELR also picks up. And a lot of these rising rents are being driven by sort of new entrants to the markets. It's not just logistics, but it's also things like dark kitchens and sort of data centres as well, which potentially creates a little bit of a challenge for the borough in terms of the density of employment, because typically these uses don't have necessarily the highest employment density of any sector. So we've got to sort of manage that and look at some of the recommendations through this industrious Ealing strategy as we go forward. So very quickly then, this is a very high level slide which synthesizes, you'll have to believe me on this, quite a lot of social and economic data to begin to understand how the Ealing economy is functioning in terms of economic geographies. So we've got about 150 slides of data to reinforce this. I can share that with the group as and when it's sort of finalized and ready. But broadly, in terms of economic characteristics, Northolt, Greenford and Perivale are one sort of economic geography of interest. And broadly, these areas are sort of connected by a SIL and the A40 corridor, but they also share significant employment specialisms that sort of are shared across the 3 sub-areas. They're also uniquely identified by their smaller town centres, which heightens the importance of the industrial areas to the economies in those areas. And over the next few weeks, we'll be prioritising the in-depth focus on those industrial areas to understand the different types of businesses that are there and the role of the local plan in sort of supporting those businesses go forward, and the role of the council in supporting those businesses going forward. The second area is Acton, Ealing and Hanwell. As I've mentioned previously, this is pretty much exclusively where all of the borough's higher value employment is located. They're all connected by the Axbridge Road, but they've also got sort of larger high street and town centres, which is where a lot of this high value activity is taking place. But again, they've got the sort of smaller but typically higher density locally significant industrial sites, which again we'll sort of do the on the ground analysis to understand and unpack in a bit more detail. Finally, Southall. This is an area of sort of higher deprivation by a lot of the social and economic metrics, and we haven't had time to delve into those today, but we've got a lot of that we can share with the group in future as well. And this is receiving bespoke attention through a separate study that's been commissioned if we made that. So they'll be going through all of the industrial areas in their entirety, getting the granularity, looking at how they sort of function, how businesses are getting on in those areas to understand the demographics of the place, which should be some really throw out some really interesting messages. So just in terms of procedure and where we go next, I think there's clearly quite a lot of fundamental things facing the Ealing economy over the next sort of few years, and how we unpack that and how we sort of record this in terms of information for the local plan is going to be very important. I think to sort of delve into those key messages, there's a couple of key questions on the why some of these things are happening that we need to answer, and we'll look to do over the next few weeks, and really understand how the local plan can sort of be maximised in order to use that as a policy lever to address some of these challenges that the data is sort of showing us. In terms of next steps, as I've mentioned a number of times throughout this presentation, we made that will be undertaking a qualitative assessment. So we'll be going to these areas to understand whether it sort of reinforces a lot of what the data is saying, or whether there's any messages that the data hasn't picked up. And then we'll be looking at recommendations and reporting to inform the local plan around April time, as is currently sort of mentioned. So I'll pass back to the chair now, and if there's any immediate questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Okay, thanks there. Yeah. Unfortunately, I missed a bit of that, as my connection seemed to have dropped at one point. But anyway, it seems to have been just me that was thrown out. So hopefully, sort of everyone else was still connected and got it all. Are there any sort of specific questions to Will on that presentation, or? So please indicate if you do have a question. Otherwise, we'll move on to the.
Yeah, I think Linda has a question first, I think, Chair, and then I've got my hand up as well.
Okay, so Councillor Burke and then Councillor Shaw.
I'm not sure if I'm going too much into the debate
and,
afterwards.
Councillor Manro as well. Councillor Manro, is that a new hand that you've put up?
Yes.
Okay, so Councillor Burke, then Councillor Shaw, then Councillor Manro. Okay,
So,
Councillor Burke, sorry.
Stop me if I'm going too much into the debate we're having afterwards. But comment first, I think this is absolutely brilliant and fascinating stuff. I'm not sure, and the comment from me is I think this should really be presented to all the councillors, because I think it's really, really important actually, about all sorts of planning. So my question, I don't know if it's for you, Will, or really for us, is one about how we make sure that we have a proper, really integrated approach to not just the planning, because this feeds into so much else that we're doing. And my worry in terms of seeing this is that this actually talks to the local plan, but really should be really informing far more our employment strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, Chital, and maybe comment for you really, is how we really make sure we embed this in all that we're doing so that our full manifesto, et cetera, is properly data informed. And then the second thing, a question possibly for Will, is if I've understood this correctly, it worries me slightly that the bulk of our local plan in terms of designated sites for where we develop intensely is really reinforcing the areas where we have the highest income and the most success already. And I know Northolt councillors have raised this before. Can we not be doing more through the local plan about distributing the good transport, the good sites, more buildings, more houses, whatever, or the kind of housing further across the borough, even if it is down that corridor? You're nodding, so I hope my question wasn't too complicated, sorry.
Okay, Will, do you want to try and answer those?
Absolutely. I don't know if Councillor Manro wants to come in on the first point, but I can take the second point to begin with. I think absolutely. I don't think we've got any. We're not at the recommendation stage yet, basically, and we're at evidence gathering stage, and that is really useful feedback. I think just from our perspective, and Sam might not like this, but I don't think we see this as purely a local plan output. It's not just to inform the local plan, and I think a lot of what you say, Councillor Burke, is there's plenty of other levers that we could propose through our recommendations that we could address some of this as well. And it's not just through planning policy, it's also through the assets that the council holds in order to drive inclusive growth. And I think I see that being the remit of this study as well, is to explore wider interventions that we can use to address some of these issues.
Okay, thanks, Will. Well,
just very briefly,
Councillor Manro, if you come
Yeah,
in
I
here
just wanted
now,
to-
and
sorry,
then
I
I'll
just
take
wanted-
Councillor Shaw's question
Yeah.
afterwards, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just come in. I think we've got Councillor Donnelly and Councillor Mahfouz here because, as I said earlier, the local plan will affect really all of our portfolios in different ways in terms of good jobs paying high incomes, because that's one of our priorities. So, and inclusive economy, actually moving development across the borough. And there's a special study in Southall looking at that. And therefore, I think, Linda, it is the case that this will affect the whole of the council's sort of plans around creating good employment, good quality industrial space. And as I said earlier, we're actually looking at maybe increasing the amount of employment space in certain locations to actually drive good quality employers into Southall, into Greenford, into Northolt, into Perivale. So really, it's a fundamental part, but this drives most of the council policies, which is why the local plan is so important. Climate change, open spaces, new office developments coming in. There's a lot of stuff happening, but this actually lets us focus on what are the key issues, and then it drives all of the council's policies in different departments: economic regeneration, employment, open spaces, parks, green space. There's a review of green space, health outcomes. I think that we're looking at health outcomes as well. So it will do that. And this is where we are. This will inform all of the council's policies, not just towards the local plan. Although the local plan actually is so big, it will cover all the different portfolio areas. And that's why Councillor Donnelly and Councillor Mahfouz are here today, because it covers a lot of their portfolios.
Okay, thanks, Chital. So perhaps we can come back to this again at the end of the meeting and give Councillor Donnelly and Councillor Mahfouz a chance to have their say at that point as well. So just for the moment then, Councillor Shaw, can you ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It was just a technical point, please, Will. I do have a couple of questions and comments, but we can save those until after the other presentation and throw it into the round. But just on the technical point of the dark kitchens, I am assuming, is this a commercial kitchen that's sort of serving basically food for deliveries now, and the uptake in that's coming out? I just wanted to clarify that I'm assuming that's what it is, but I don't know the technical term. So that's all for now. Thanks.
Thanks for your question on that, Councillor Shaw. I'm actually going to duck that question and pass it to Sam Cuthbert, because that's from the draft ELR, which is produced separately. So do you have an answer to that, Sam?
I do, yes. Dark kitchens for evil food. No, you're exactly correct, Councillor Shaw. It's non-public facing kitchens that supply delivery services, as opposed to delivery services collecting specifically from local restaurants, that sort of thing. And you're probably aware that's been particularly proliferating in London, and of course, particularly over the pandemic as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, I can't see anyone indicating any further questions. So perhaps, so thanks for that presentation, Will. Okay, then, well, back to you then, Sam, to introduce the next and final speaker of this evening.
Thank you, Chair. So our next speaker is Nicholas Bozzetti from the Centre of London. You are, Nico, the head of data and insight. I actually have your business, your formal business title. And rather than droning on about the Industrial Land Commission, I will let you introduce that. But of course, Ealing has been very pleased to be involved in its work.
Thanks very much, Sam. Thank you first very much for having me. Just a few words about Centre for London before I start. We are the independent think tank for the capital, and we've existed since 2010 to create research and events that offer solutions to London's pressing challenges and advocate for London at national level. Critical time for doing that. Thanks to the support of Ealing and other boroughs, we convened an independent commission on the future of industrial land in London, which was chaired by Liz Peace, CBE, which I'm sure you will know because she operates on your patch, and supported by us, the Secretariat at Centre for London. And the commission, I think, explored a kind of a broader question than I think the focus of the Ealing plan tonight, but will be hugely relevant. And that question is, how can London make the best use of limited available land and meet what are often portrayed as competing needs, though I think it's more helpful to think of these as complementary needs to industrial and housing and other needs. So before I start, just a bit of definitions on what actually happens on industrial land, because it does accommodate very different economic activities. Simon will have talked about this already, but activities really range from traditional manufacturing that produce anything from sugar to biscuits to foldable bikes, or set props for London's theatres, and you can see a picture of that on the left, to infrastructure that ranges again from waste management sites, water storage, and warehouses. And then also a lot of non-industrial activities that do service the services and are essential for them to function. And that goes from catering to printing. You see a printing press here on the right. Cleaning, hospitality, security, maintenance of vehicles. It's also a crucial part of London's cultural and creative economy. It's industrial land is home to film studios, galleries, and artist studios. We went to the commission on a tour of Buckney and Dagenham and Enfield, and we were repeatedly told about the number of demands for filming in film studios there. And given Ealing's history, I'm sure you have as many people knocking on your doors for hosting filming. We've heard a lot about cities in London releasing industrial land. It's not just happening in London, it's a trend across UK cities. But London's context is unique. First of all, London has seen a sharper fall in its industrial floor space. It's decreased by 24% over the last 2 decades. And London's context is different because of its much faster population growth, and because it is very big. And so the periphery is far away from the center, and you can't service the city center or much of the neighborhoods by putting industrial accommodation at its fringe. You need it mixed in its neighborhoods for it to work. Looking in more detail at what's happened within London, we're seeing really large differences in industrial floor space release, again, in the last 2 decades. Ealing finds itself to have the largest amount of industrial floor space of any London borough. That's partly due to its size. And in terms of release, it's pretty much in the average for Outer London Borough, a decrease of 10% in industrial accommodation over the last 20 years. A slightly smaller decrease than its neighbouring boroughs, I would say. The first big topic of discussion and kind of realization that the Commission came with was that we do not have enough industrial land in London. And there's very strong evidence of this now. Vacancy rates have fallen. They were really high in 2001 at 16%. They are now 4% across London, but they're much lower in West London, especially if you look at buildings. And so we've heard that there were virtually no vacancies left in terms of industrial buildings. And that means it's very hard for business to find space to move on to and to grow. And it's virtually impossible for them to find space that meets their specific needs, because it's very unlikely that space will be coming forward to be available. As a result, industrial land values in rents are increasing. The figures are astounding. In 2020, land values in Park Royal were as high as £7 million per acre, up from an average of 2.5 million per acre in 2017. Some businesses and sectors can meet these costs, and they are driving this increase. Others are being squeezed out. And it's fair to say that Londoners are taking relatively little notice of this. And that's partly due to a lack of understanding of the different ways that as a city we depend on industrial land and the contribution it makes to London's economy. And that means there's no really strong public pushback against this release. And it becomes easier to prioritize housing. The report talks a lot about why London needs industrial land within the city, and I won't go on too long on this because I know you're very keen on the topic already. But the Commission came to the assessment that further reductions in industrial land will impact on London's economic success, on its ability to meet its net zero challenge, and meet changing behaviours, such as the continued rise in the number of personal deliveries. So, as part of the project, the Commission's kind of set five issues to address in order to kind of fix the issue here. The first one is, how do we give industrial land occupiers more influence to avoid them being at the losing end of the planning system? The second one is, how can we find out how much land is needed locally and of what type? It would be impossible for us here to go into detail borough by borough basis, but the idea is to help policymakers protect and provide what the market needs. We also looked at how we go about protecting industrial space more effectively and avoid the kind of rates of release that have not been controlled in the past decade, but also more flexibly. So we don't risk losing crucial floor space to other users. We are then looking at how we can create more industrial accommodation within London, for instance, through intensification and co-location, so that we can make more intelligent use of existing space. And then we look at what support London government needs to do all this. And the final Commission's report comes up with 6 main solutions, which I will talk you through in turn. The first one is the need to give industrial land occupiers more influence. And the fundamental recommendation here is that we need to bring industrial land occupier into a vocal group and ensure that they have the ear of policymakers. The first recommendation is that the Industrial and Logistics Sounding Board, which was set up by the GLA a few years ago and has just been reconvened, should morph into a powerful group that's independent and led by the private sector, and so that they are able to review evidence independently and push policymakers what they wish to. The second recommendation is that this group should be organizing public campaigns and open doors events to increase the public visibility and understanding of industrial land and activities that take place on it. We also recommend that the Mayor of London identifies a deputy mayor to have a renewed focus on industrial land occupiers and their needs. It's fair to say that the issue cuts across a lot of different briefs, and that makes it hard for businesses to know who to engage with. And finally, with support of the GLA and support of the private sector, there should be an upskilling of borough staff working with industrial land to help them understand occupier needs and their implications for planning. The second solutions are linked to improving the evidence base to inform land use decisions. And it's been fascinating to look at Sand and Will's work earlier. We're recommending that the process for gathering evidence, which already exists at City Hall and borough level, but is usually infrequent and not as attuned to conditions on the ground and granular changes as they could be. So we're recommending that the GLA use live property market data for its supply studies and update these annually so that there is a nearly constant drip of information on what's actually going on London's industrial land. The second recommendation is that boroughs should lead on needs assessment because they are best placed to develop an understanding of their patch, and that they should do this in a more granular and up-to-date way. And so, for instance, basing and employment land reviews on market intelligence and industrial land audits, like the one that Will and colleagues at We Made That are doing, not just economic models and forecasts, which we've witnessed in the last couple of years just become out of date so quickly. To help with this, real estate companies should make industrial and market data readily available to policymakers. It's not the case currently, and it's crucially missing. And finally, the London Plan and local plan review processes should consider housing and industrial demand together to avoid one taking precedence over the other. Our third type of solution is around how we enhance local planning protection and flexibility. It's impossible for the Commission to say what should be protected, intensified, or released, and where, because London is so big and complex, but we can set out how these decisions should be made. And the first recommendation here is that boroughs should be taking more responsibility for their industrial land policy, because they are best placed to do this, so they can reflect their local circumstances. Boroughs already have planning powers to do this. They just need to be utilized to their full extent to protect industrial space. Around 30% of London's industrial land isn't protected by designation. And while London plan policies will offer some protection, especially in the not so new London plan, boroughs should protect remaining industrial spaces through powers that they have through designation. We also would like national government to ensure that boroughs have more freedom to set different levels of protective designation for industrial and floor space. Currently, it's very much a protected or not protected. And we think that it should be a more granular approach that reflects the criticality of the use that's taking place on a piece of land. And then there are more recommendations for government to limit the scope of PDR. It could have benefits to creating new industrial accommodation. In other places, it could result in a loss. And where that's the case, it should be curbed. And boroughs should also be ensuring that the new Class E premises can meet the needs of light industrial activities. We have quite a few recommendations on how we can make better use of existing industrial spaces through intensification. Obviously, it's a lot easier to protect industrial land than to develop new accommodation. And intensification of industrial land use does offer a supplement of protection, but it is quite expensive to achieve. And we've identified a market failure in this taking place at a larger scale. So we're recommending that the mayor should facilitate intensification of existing sites by creating an industrial space investment fund to co-invest in developments that provide stacked industrial floor space, like the one in the picture here. And then the mayor and the boroughs should identify opportunities for intensification of industrial floor space on land that they own. And there are similar recommendations for how to make co-location work better. And be a bit more creative. There are a lot of opportunities for co-location, not just between sometimes of industrial developments which are quite neighbourly with residential, but also between industrial and office and industrial and retail. And so here again, we'd like to see the mayor to subsidise developments that provide new industrial floor space in locations where there isn't currently, based again on the high cost of developing this kind of space. And then case studies on how to do it well, and for industrial businesses to really build knowledge and work with residential developers which may not know very well how to provide space for industrial businesses in co-located scheme, so that when this space is provided, it works for a range of businesses. And finally, there will need to be a continuing role for City Hall and strategic policy, but the Commission was very concerned about ensuring that the London Plan has minimum interference from national government, so that the London Plan can really reflect the particularity of the challenges that London faces. And also would like the National Infrastructure Commission to work with London government and with neighbouring authorities to identify opportunities for industrial and at London's fringes, and how investment in infrastructure could unlock that. So for instance, there was an example of a disused freight route, which could unlock a lot of land at the immediate west of London and give great access to freight in a sustainable way. And more of this work should be taking place. So that is it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I know it's the third presentation tonight, but I can say that we are actually launching the report next week, and that several of our commissioners will be there to discuss the findings and to take any of the questions. So if you are free then, we would love to have you. It's next Thursday at 4 p.m. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nico. Are there any questions from any councillors? Any questions for or points of clarification for Nico? So. Okay, I can't see any virtual hands, so if anyone does have a question, please sort of shout out. Okay, if not, okay, thanks very much then, Nico. So, okay, there was quite a bit of thought, of food for thought in that presentation, as in the others. So, I don't know if you want to add anything, Sam, and then if you do, then we'll move to sort of general discussion after that.
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, I mean, I think based on Nico's presentation, certainly you will see the point that I was trying to highlight at the beginning, which is really that while we start off from a kind of very boring, very technical planning basis of doing demand against supply, actually in relation to the real issues that are involved, they stretch a lot broader. And they certainly go beyond existing governance, even within London, even up to the GLA level, and pose a lot of questions about national approaches to industry and to employment in general. So I think that was one of the reasons why we were so interested to participate in the Commission, and why we're very pleased to have Nico here to give everyone an advanced view of the study that will be launched next week.
Okay, thanks very much then, Sam. Okay then, so I'll throw the meeting open to just general questions or contributions, or anything that anyone wants to sort of ask or wants to say. Okay, I can see Libby Kemp and Councillor Shaw and Councillor Woodruff. So I'll take those three first. Okay, so Libby, over to you.
I thought this was one of the best both of them are the best presentations we've ever had in the whole of this series. And I'm really pleased, because we had something last year on economic growth and it was absolutely appalling. When I first moved to the borough almost 25 years ago, I was working in economic planning regeneration. And I phoned up Ealing Council and I said, could you put me through to your economic planning department? Because all the other areas I'd worked in the country had them. And I wanted this sort of information. Ealing had none. So I'm really pleased to see it 25 years later that we have this really good firm information from Will. But going on from that, I mean, I think it's really important that we do employ, and Peter Mason keeps on going on that we shouldn't be a dormitory town, we should have people employed. But there are two problems. One of them is we fine for graduates, but we have nothing for the school leavers. We have very, very poor further education and training in the borough. And it's not something probably we can do much about, but it certainly should be looked at. And the other thing is, maybe we should replace one of the senior regeneration people with somebody who is actually really experienced in looking at jobs and employment. And I know when I worked in the Northeast, there were specialists who were fantastic at finding and bringing businesses in and businesses on. And ones that employ a lot of people, because logistics don't employ many people. Data centers certainly don't. They just take up space and make a noise. So we really need a specialist employed by the borough who is good at finding the right sort of employment for the borough based on the research that both Will and Nico have done.
Chair, you're still muted.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. I unmuted myself and muted myself like half a second later, I think. Yes. So sorry. Thanks. Thanks for that question or that contribution. I think I'll take Councillor Shaw and Councillor Woodruff to make their contributions. So if the members of the panel, the presenters are now the panel, if you can note the points you want to respond to there, and then we'll respond to a sort of batch of contributions. So Councillor Shaw, your turn now.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. and I would echo Libby's comments there that I think there's been three excellent presentations that have really complemented each other and really shown, you know, the sort of choices, if you like, that we have to make as policymakers. Obviously, we're looking here particularly at industrial and employment, and of course we have to balance that with, you know, what we know is a chronic shortage of housing and affordable housing. And so when we're sort of looking at whether it's sort of releasing land that we own, as Nico and Will were talking about, you know, I mean, does that land get released? Do we put it into housing? You know, and this is what the local plan has to sort of decide, or do we push it towards, you know, industrial or commercial use? One of the questions, I think, and I don't know what the data set is like, but I think it'd be helpful for us as policymakers, is just looking purely in very stark terms now as to, you know, how many residents we have that actually sort of live and work in the borough. You know, I mean, I happen to be one that I'm aware of, so there we go, there's a start. But nevertheless, you know, and we have identified, you know, that some of the problem and the problem in the differences in wealth, if you like, and distribution of wealth across the borough is that, you know, in the central Ealing, Acton areas, transport links go into central London and then come back, where a lot of people might be employed and working. And, you know, it's about making sure that there's the range of employment opportunities available and those that are needed, and that industrial space is needed as well. You know, as you know, the presentations showed a clear demonstration of the shortage that London is having, if you like, as industry moves out of London and is being squeezed out of London. So I suppose a question really, and it would be for sort of Sam and Will and Nico, is where you thought, looking at the industrial space, if you like, and release of land, where or how you thought or would advise us as policy makers to try and get that balance, and what you think would be the best driver there. You know, is it necessarily employment only of our residents? I mean, the map that showed the industrial space clearly showed some of the big industrial spaces like ODPC, for example, or up in Northolt and what have you, is largely around the edges of the borough. And so that will be bringing people in from neighbouring boroughs and so on, of course. You know, yes, we need to look at Ealing because that's what we're looking at. But nevertheless, you know, those boundaries are very permeable in terms of movement of people and so on. So yes, just what do you think are the sort of key drivers and things that we should be looking at in terms of release and getting that balance right between the employment needs and the housing needs as well, that obviously, you know, hasn't been part of this tonight, but we've looked at in previous meetings.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Shaw. Okay, so if people can just sort of keep that question in their minds, and I'll take the question from Councillor Woodruff.
Yeah, I don't know so much a question, it's just observation. I mean, I've just recently retired as being employed by the London Borough of Islington, so that's one follow-up. But I represent Greenford Green, which has quite a large amount of industrial. It's got industrial parks in. It's got a distribution to countries like Tesco, Sainsbury's, Tatar's there, the national headquarters of Ferrero Rocher. So it's quite a big industry. It used to have the headquarters of Glaxo. Of course, Glaxo went and has been completely replaced by housing development, which we think is very good. We need more houses, but it's interesting that and that's what's happening. It's quite often industry versus housing for all that sort of thing. What I'm interested in, I represented Greenford Green for a while. We've got all this industrial thing. I never have any contact with the people who run any of those companies at all. We have with ordinary residents. I know Ealing has a body where it sort of talks to in industry on a sort of borough basis, but I'm just interested that we never, as far as I'm concerned, we got all that industrial space, but it's completely separate from local councillors. And I just wondered whether it would be a good idea to have some sort of means of talking to them, because as you say, I think industrial use is very important. It's very important for employment, but we never have any contact at all. That's all I've got to say, really. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Okay, well, I'll ask the panel to come back with any sort of answers that they've got to those points, or any sort of observations that they want to make. So I don't know which one of you. So that's sort of Sam or Nico or Will. I don't know which one of you wants to go first. So you want to?
I'll kick things off if I may, Chair. Particularly sort of deal with the aspects that relate to sort of broader policy approach. So a number of questions around sort of the conflict which exists has existed in the past between housing supply and industrial supply. I mean, I'm pleased to say I don't think that conflict exists in a practical sense anymore, simply because we've now reached a stage in which it's no longer viable to do one or the other. Basically, if we build more housing without the support services that are associated with industrial space, so whether that be general logistics services that serve home delivery, or more complex kind of business-to-business trade, which relates to even constructing that housing. So, for example, just to highlight, one of the things that came out of the ELR was that construction, a requirement for construction space, is a growing part of industrial needs. Effectively, we have to find a way of making them both work. We're not in a position where we can or we should be choosing between the two. And a specific example of that would be the potential that I identified, which is something we'll particularly be interrogating, that we'll particularly be looking at in inclusive growth, for co-location of industry and employment, particularly on LSIS sites. Now, the reason that we're looking at that, it's not to drive housing growth, or that would be a benefit to it. It's because we have some industrial spaces, and Nico mentioned this as well, which cannot commercially be provided. You cannot pay for the delivery of the space based on the rents that you would achieve for that space. So you effectively have three choices. You can provide that with a very, very high value co-located use like residential. You can provide that with a larger, more viable industrial use, which would primarily be logistics. And that is something that we'll be examining. Or you can simply not provide that space at all. I think for a number of reasons, that's quite clearly undesirable. So I think certainly there's a strong potential for housing growth and industrial growth to complement each other. Turning to, I think your second point, Councillor Shaw, talking about employment and the location of employment in particular, I would start by saying jobs is a terribly difficult metric for planning, largely because businesses don't exist to create employment. They exist to provide services or generate profit, produce products. And of course, in some senses, that militates against employment. So I think from the point of view of planning for jobs growth, we need to be thinking in relation to the types of sector or the types of premises that we need or would like to see. And one of the benefits of having this immense demand, I mean, certainly in discussions with the ELR consultants, they've characterised demand for industrial space in Ealing as being furious at the moment. There's in fact an odd disjunction, which I think will probably come on to his response, in the projections that they've seen between absolutely unsuppressed demand with rather limited gains in jobs and GVA. So that's one of the things that we're seeking to unpick through the inclusive growth study. I think also talking the cross-border point was kind of interesting, because one of the things about the types of industrial space that exist on the edge of the borough is that actually they very typically draw quite a local workforce. I mean, they may have some supply work from just across the borough where they sit right on the boundary, but actually a lot of those spaces, when you do workplace surveys, for example, Park Royal, also particularly out to Northolt, they have a very local employment, which is partly to do with the difficulty of accessing those spaces. So I would say there's certainly, again, there's a possibility for those spaces to actually drive a disproportionate benefit, that any new uses you get there are more likely to see local benefits than elsewhere. And I think Councillor Woodruff's point was very well made in relation to the current sort of lack of engagement that exists in general between the council and these large premises, which in some ways is to do with the nature of the business model. So a lot of the borough's industrial space and logistics, for example, is held by C Group or by comparable firms who basically engage with the council when they build that space, or engage at a fairly high level with officers as to their future plans and the council's future plans. But again, looking forward to the approach the local plan will take, the 7 towns approach, which I know the administration has advanced, and which makes a very great deal of sense in planning terms, which looks at reintegrating those sorts of uses of restoring the relationship between living and working, for example, will, I think, help a lot of that engagement, will help drive spaces where there's more daily engagement with the people who live and work there, and the types of uses that exist in those places. So all very interesting points, and I think hopefully I've opened up the debate for Will and for Nico to come in rather than stealing any of your points. I don't know, Will, if you want to start off perhaps on the
yeah, sure. No, you haven't stolen anything, Sam. Don't worry. Just there was one technical point on data by Councillor Shaw on data on people living and working in the borough, which I think is a good question. It's the $1 million question, really, in terms of understanding the sort of containment of Ealing's labour market, and what we're ultimately talking about in terms of jobs in the borough. Is it for residents, or are they for people coming in? Noting the fluidity of the London labour market, people don't sort of adhere to borough boundaries as much as we'd like them to in terms of ease of data. I think the simple answer is the authoritative source on that is the census, and that's noting that the last census data that we've got accessible to us is 2011 now, and unfortunately the next census, which we've all filled in a few months ago, isn't likely to be ready in time for this study. What we can do in terms of understanding what the containment of Ealing's labour market is like, we can sort of triangulate a few sources in effect. So one of the things that we tend to look at in between census years is looking at the disparity between resident and workplace earnings. So is the difference between those living in the borough highly different to those that are working in the borough? And what we found in Ealing is that there isn't a massive disparity. So I think the sort of the notion that you've got the majority of the people living in the borough commuting into London for work just isn't true. There might be a significant proportion that do, but I think on the whole, the averages prove that probably isn't the case. And the other thing we can look at, and what we're going to be looking at in a little bit more detail, is look at things like population churn. So for example, there's some really good data sets on looking at how the proportion of houses within an area appear to have changed occupier. So by that, if there's sort of quite low population churn, which, I mean, in a London borough, there's never low population churn, but if there's lower population churn, you can effectively say parts of the census are likely to be more accurate than in other parts of the borough. So I think we can expect a lot lower churn in the sort of suburbs of the borough, certainly in around Greenford and Perivale, whilst that's likely to still be fairly high. That's one way of looking at it. So that's a long way of saying we don't have an authoritative view on it other than the 2011 data, and the sort of latest data probably isn't going to be available for this study. But there's a number of ways we can perhaps infer what the conclusion's likely to be for that. Just to add on one point to what Sam was saying around jobs and GVA, and GVA is a sort of measure for success, and GVA is a measure for sort of how Ealing's economy is likely to grow and what we want to prioritise in terms of economic activity within the borough. When you're looking at technical reports like an employment land review, and it sort of splits out GVA by sector, what we want to be quite careful of, and what our report will help to sort of augment the ELR in doing, is sort of by sort of noting that the employment densities that align with certain sectors. So for example, activities like jobs in data centres are likely to be very high in GVA terms because they're high productivity jobs potentially, but they're not likely to create the quantums of jobs that we want to see in Ealing. So all of this is about sort of layers of evidence and really sort of getting under the skin of what the data is saying and actually coming to an agreed position of what our measures of success are. Is it, and I guess the steer to date has been more high quality jobs, which we'll be able to sort of advise on based on the sort of granularity of our study.
Okay, thanks, Will. Okay. Nico, is that, do you have anything to add?
I'm going to violently agree with what Sam and Will have said. On the point of how to get the balance right, it's very much that we need both, and how do we make space for both? And here I would say doing all you can to promote stacked industrial developments and co-location. I think what also helps here is the flexibility point, because industrial activities are changing. You don't always need industrial where it's been before, but you might need it where you don't have it yet. And that's why here looking at office spaces, high streets, especially for those smaller, more neighborly industrial users, which often get priced out by the kind of bigger logistics players, could be an opportunity here. And it can be also an opportunity to meet other of your objectives in terms of revitalizing our high streets and making up for the lack of office workers in town centers. So like kind of bring up new life there. There's another point just to stress, which is if you know that you make space for both, how do you find out how much you need of each? And obviously there's brilliant work that that Will and Sam are doing and others. But it'd be helpful here to have, I think, some metrics. We know that every new home creates a need for delivery space, for construction, consolidation space. Will has mentioned this. It's really interesting. And if you can get a metric for, right, each new home that you build will create X demand on industrial land nearby and further away, then you can start to see how both are complementary and and get a bit more systematic about meeting your needs. There's a point also about workforce, which is really interesting because industrial land really is one of the only or main provider of jobs outside central London. So I'm going to rephrase this. Most professional services jobs are focused in central London and some town centres. That's not the case for industrial land. And so it really is part of the 15-minute city ethos to kind of protect that industrial land where it is, and especially in outer London. But workforce is not the kind of be all and end all of why we need industrial land here. And we've touched on data centers, which provide crucial services, recycling and waste, which also are very low employment densities. But if you start locating this kind of low employment densities further away from the city, then you run into climate issues and what goods and lorries kind of traveling further away, and you kind of stay further away from meeting net zero. So the kind of climate emergency lens is interesting here, and one of the reasons why you will need industrial land within the city.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'll take another round of questions then. I can see Councillor Martin, and are there any other sort of councillors who want to say anything at this point? Okay, so Councillor Martin, Councillor Burke. Okay, well, I can't see anyone else at this point. Oh, okay, and Councillor Donnelly. Okay, well, I'll take them in that order then. If Councillor Martin, if you could go first, then Councillor Burke, then we'll let Councillor Donnelly come in. So, Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Chair. So I was just going to make a general observation, I suppose, that whilst taking note of what Will said, that people don't always go where you want them to, I would hope that one of the objectives of our local plan is to make it, is an aim to have employment more local, because I think it does tick a lot of boxes, including sort of climate issues, etc., but also quality of life. So I think that's something that we should be aiming for. But I was on a planning committee, you might have been there as well, Chair, I'm not sure, where we looked at a co-location site in Acton. And I know we all had our reservations about it. And part of that, I think, is really getting better at defining what is light industrial, what it does lend itself to co-location with housing, and maybe we could strengthen that a bit more, so we've got a better understanding of what will work in that sort of cohabiting environment, if you like, because I think it's got a lot of potential, but we did have our reservations because we weren't sure what the impact would be on the residents. So that's one thing I think we should build into it. But the other thing, especially given what Nico was saying about the horrendous rise in rents for industrial sites, is are we going to look at sort of affordable elements of industrial space, and how we're going to build that into the plan to ensure that we are encouraging businesses to come here and giving them that sort of level of support where they aren't just sort of priced out of the area. So that's another thing that I just wanted to add that I think would be important. That's all from me, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Martin. And Councillor Burke.
It's really just a bit of a repeat of what I said before. It's a plea really in terms of, for us as councillors, perhaps to have a further event, maybe with some officers, around really about the integration of this, because I do think that if this information doesn't link in with the other things that we're doing, not just through the local plan, I mean, things like apprenticeships, things like, as Dee's just referred to, things like in terms of how we're thinking about employment. I totally appreciate what Chitel said, but I don't think it quite answered my question about how we are going to have an integrated approach to work that isn't just leaving it to the local plan, but actually feeds this information into the other activities that we're doing.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Okay, well, I have Councillor Donnelly wants to come in, and Councillor Mahfouz as well. So I think we'll hear from both of them, and perhaps one or even both of them we'll have some ideas on how we can do just what you were asking about. So, Councillor Donnelly.
Yeah, just starting with that, Chair. I guess, Linda, the answer is that this is going to be part of the Cabinet's agenda. It's not going to be part of the LD PAC's agenda purely. It's part of the Cabinet agenda, and it's been a really interesting experience for me to hear the presentations from their different angles, and to the cogs are turning in my old head as to how I can contribute and what I can get from the work that's being done, in my own portfolio, and also in cooperation with Councillor Mahfouz, Councillor Manro in theirs. I mean, I had a number of things early on I was thinking of saying, and between them, Councillors Manro and Shaw ticked most of them off. But I guess, I suppose I was thinking, if we'd sat here 10 years ago, waiting for someone to invent Zoom probably, but if we'd sat here 10 years ago, we could have had a similar conversation, and we'd have looked ahead to a number of foreseeable changes. And we'd never have seen Brexit coming, and we'd never have seen COVID coming. And in the next 10 years, we can see a number of foreseeable changes. And there's a couple of things a couple of asteroids, maybe literally an asteroid. I mean, God knows, I'd believe anything now. But there's a couple of asteroids going to hit us that we can't prepare for. But there's some the underlying basics are always about, what's your geography? What are your transport links? What's your infrastructure? What's the education and training of your population? And those things condition who comes, who builds what they make, whether they're products or services, how easy it is for your workforce to travel, and therefore how far will the workforce be away. The higher profile, higher income jobs will attract people who can afford to travel a bit further to get to them. So you're actually casting the net a bit further out. So I think all I'll say at this point really is I see it as part of my job to accentuate the role of the council in bringing players together, in getting synergy, use that sort of terrible old presentational word, but I guess to make things more than the sum of their parts in terms of what we can deliver. I mean, I think Councillor Shaw briefly mentioned OPDC. It's kind of the elephant in the room in this discussion, because it's something that is both of us and not of us. We don't control, or we contribute, but we don't control its policy. So I think there's a huge amount for us to get our heads around, and I know what I do flips on into Councillor Mahfouz's role, leading more directly into relationships with business, with employers. So I'm sure he's got more to add on that. But I just want to say thank you, and you've given us tremendous food for thought.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, Councillor Mahfouz, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Nico, Sam and Will for their excellent presentations and the work that's been going on that's been obviously presented this evening. It's great to get the positive feedback from councillors and members of the public who are members of this committee as well. So that's great stuff. Before I go into some of the sort of more general stuff, I just thought I'd go into some of the questions just really quickly, because I appreciate sort of time and everything else. But I think first of all, Libby Kemp was saying that we have very poor further education and sort of further education services within the borough. And as the cabinet member who is the lead for Learn Ealing, which was formerly the Ealing Adult Service, I've got to say I feel like Actually, they recently achieved the Matrix accreditation. They very much, from what I've seen, punch above their weight in terms of their income, which they get from a central source compared to the outcomes. There's almost 4,500 residents who have benefited from Learn Ealing over the past 3.5 years, with over 10,000 credited qualifications between them, which have helped us as part of our outcome that we're trying to achieve in terms of decent living incomes. And actually, we've talked about the industrial element today, and it wasn't that long ago we were talking about the complete collapse of HGV services. And again, so for example, Learn Ealing stepped in and have been providing training to our residents to make sure that they are qualified and can get into the sorts of jobs where we are where we desperately need those roles to be filled, and that's in order to make sure that we protect our own services like greener Ealing, but also to make sure that those people can go on to the sorts of jobs which obviously now pay much better and are on offer locally. So I think I just wanted to sort of challenge that particular point, but obviously we've had sort of different points as Gareth raised about how many residents live and work within the borough. It's changing, and obviously appreciate in terms of sort of it's great to hear that a lot of our residents work within the borough as well, but we're certainly seeing certain industries. What is the future of office space, for example? So and one thing that I think, Councillor D. Martin referred to actually about the co-working spaces, which were certainly on the rise in the past, but were really sort of for small businesses, budding entrepreneurs, spaces for innovation, hubs for innovation, and so on. Actually, it could very much be the future of where people want to work, because they could work locally in an office environment without having to travel all the way into central London, and have the sort of buzz that they might have from being in an office without having to do the travel. And so we don't know what the future holds. As Councillor Steve Donnelly pointed out, goodness knows what could be in the future, but that certainly is a potential prospect. And I think this balance between homes, industry, workspace is really, really important. In terms of types of businesses, just to remind everyone, we've just successfully got funding for Creative Enterprise Zone. That bid has been successful for Park Royal as well, which is brilliant. And then there's going to be, as Dee pointed out, in terms of employment being more local, I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the environmental side of things and work-life balance, but she absolutely touched upon the affordable workspace, and that is something that we are very much looking to build into the plans that we've got this evening. And Linda, in terms of the point about integration, from everything that I've seen, obviously you've got the discussion points from this evening, but very much these go hand in hand with a lot of the other conversations that are going on within the Regen team more widely, but they're also connecting with other parts of the organisation. So from whether it's the employment team, whether it's the environmental team and so on. So in terms of sort of connecting all of those dots, because ultimately we've seen the pandemic has changed so much, and about what we do, how we do it, and for me and my cabinet colleagues, this is about how we reshape that borough. With every economic dip, you've got an opportunity to reset the economy with the recovery that we've got, and ensure that we use the land that we've got available to do exactly what we've said on the tin, which is to create good, well-paid jobs for our residents. So that is a balance about the type of industries and types of jobs that we have here, but also very, very importantly about creating a greener, more sustainable jobs. And what moves us to a circular economy. That isn't just what we've talked about this evening. There are also, what do we do with our high streets? And I'm very keen to make sure that we move to, as well as that 20-minute neighbourhoods, both in terms of sort of the high street, the industrial spaces, and something I know, what I'm very keen to sort of push forward is our ultra low waste neighbourhoods, where we're bringing together communities, high street businesses, business entrepreneurs and so on who work from their homes on local industries and so on, and bring those all together to develop what can be truly ultra low waste neighbourhoods. So that's something that's really, really quite exciting, and that I really want us to make sure that we're at the forefront of doing. As I say, it's not only about protecting and enhancing the workspace within the borough, but as Dee pointed out, developing affordable workspace in the same way that we think, without a second thought, about developing affordable housing. So Chair, it's why I think this work is so important and absolutely integrated from what I've seen to deliver a more inclusive economy, decent living incomes, and tackle climate change.
Okay, thanks very much, Councillor Mahfouz. Okay, well, as it is just after 8 o'clock now, we will have to be bringing the meeting to a close soon. So before I go back to the panel to give their responses, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question or who hasn't contributed who would like to say something? I don't want anyone to not have a chance to have their say. Okay, so feel free to indicate if you do have something to say. If not, okay, okay. Well, I'll go back to the panel then for their sort of winding up contributions, really, to the points from the last few sort of speakers. So I guess we'll may as well stick to the same order as last time. So so starting with you then, Sam.
Thanks, Chair. What I'll try to do is talk to the things that are specifically about local plan and perhaps leave both time and broader questions for Nico and Will. First of all, Councillor Martin had a specific question about co-location, which I very much agree with and take to heart. I think the question, first of all, we need to understand co-location. It's a somewhat experimental product, and officers are clear about that. I think we're reasonably clear about that when we try to present schemes to members. What I'd suggest the key approach needs to be is about defining the type of space that we want to provide, rather than allowing ourselves to get into sort of contradictions about what light industrial space might look like and how does it integrate with housing. Look rather at the outcomes of what's the type of space that we need to provide for those businesses, and therefore what are the sort of safeguards and design measures that we need to implement. Similarly, on affordable workspace, I didn't mention it largely because we've already got quite a full agenda and set of presentations, but we do have an affordable workspace study underway, and that will address precisely those issues, particularly focusing on industrial uses as well as the sort of more conventional office provision. Councillor Burke, I'm very glad you restated your sort of earlier question because I didn't have much time to come back on that the first time around. But just to note that the affordable workspace, the inclusive growth study is just the planning output of a much broader piece of work that's being done with the regeneration team, specifically to look at the possibility of those sort of longer term, more integrated, broader aspects of this question, which is the industrious healing study. And so basically the purpose of having the inclusive growth study, both as that part of that study and having it in general, is to address, if you like, what is probably going to be the most immediate aspect of that strategy, which is to say, what do we allocate those sites for, and what does the local plan say about these topics? We certainly don't view the local plan as being the exclusive method of delivering that, and I think the structures are already in place in terms of that study to sort of propagate those questions through the rest of the regeneration workload and planning process. Councillor Donnelly, you had a positive think piece on various aspects of the borough's economy and employment prospects. The aspect I noted down to address really was that the dangers of projections, which I completely agree with, having, as I say, commissioned a series of projections back in 2019 and having seen them, if not confounded, then certainly challenged by recent events. What I would suggest in general as a planning approach to sort of projection-based method of evidencing plans is that instead of looking at more and more controlled outputs at driving a floor space figure or a jobs figure or something like that, we need to ensure those plans are informed by some broader objectives, things around the social objectives, the physical structure of settlements, that sort of thing, And if that's incorporated into plans, then they're likely to be more resilient to those unexpected events. Similarly, Councillor Mahfouz, I think, made a not unrelated point, which I would see as relating particularly to the fact that this is what we see this in the local plan as being one of three main cross-cutting themes. It's not separate from health, it's related to health. It's not separate from climate action. It's highly related to that. And we hope to show that emerging through the structure of the plan as we begin to publish proposals. Just very briefly on future of office space, I'd say your points, Councillor Mahfouz, also relate to the sort of 7 towns approach, the geographical approach that I discussed in the presentation. And we would see local hubs. I quite agree with you on local hubs. We'd see this as potentially not being just confined to main town centres, but also possibly to the borough's subsidiary economic centres, and even to helping diversify and densify industrial sites.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Okay, Will.
Thanks, Chair. Just very quickly, because I think Sam's covered the majority of it, and it's just to pick up on that final point from Councillor Mahfouz and Councillor Martin as well, because aware that quite a lot of the data that we presented today was sort of building the case for intervention, presenting quite a negative picture of all the stuff associated with the pandemic and the economic fallout of that on the borough and on the country more generally. But one of the things to note is that this study needs to build on Ealing's strengths, and one of the strengths that the data has shown throughout the pandemic is the resilience of local centres, and having employment in those centres and having local hubs, as you've sort of phrased it, is, I think, a really important ingredient in sort of building on that resilience. So we've got a lot of evidence that sort of looks and tracks retail spend across all of Ealing centres throughout the pandemic. And it's those local centres with a strong local catchment that have been the most resilient throughout the pandemic. So I'm talking about Southall, I'm talking about Greenford, and I'm talking about Northolt as well, have all seen quite strong retail spend throughout that pandemic. So it's about, through this strategy, not just focusing on industrial areas, as Sam said, the remit of this is sort of a bit broader of our work, but also advising how this sort of feeds into the future of employment and work in town centres, and building on some of these observed strengths that we can evidence through the data. Pass over to Nico.
Okay, over to you then, Nico. Thanks.
I'll just add, because Simon will have said everything, on the point about reservations on collocation. It's interesting that industrial land occupiers are also worried about collocation, because they're worried that they might not be able to use the space in the way they need without generating complaints from residents. So it kind of works both ways. And here we were looking into building an index of neighborliness, which could set out the kind of levels of, say, traffic, noise that activities generate, to kind of then decide what design features you put in. So that might make it work. And also involving industrial occupiers here is helpful to make sure the space works for them too. And then there's a really interesting question on whether we need affordable industrial land. And I don't think the Commission came to a decision on this. But there is an opportunity to intensify industrial land in a way that is maybe less expensive than building a brand new stacked shed. And that is by working with landowners and occupiers to, for instance, pool yard spaces. So like sharing yard space, that you can use some of it to build sheds, or building mezzanines inside existing sheds. So kind of cheaper ways of better using the existing industrial land, which would then allow you to produce more affordable industrial space.
Okay, thanks very much then, Nico. Okay, well, I'd better draw the meeting to a close now then. Yeah, I mean, there's been three very interesting speakers there, and a lot of kind of topics that give food to thought. I mean, the thought did occur to me that there would be, some material here that would be a good topic for a future, scrutiny panel in the council to look at. Probably at least sort of one or two topics that a scrutiny panel could look at. But anyway, I'll leave that for members to think about, and if one or more of them wants to feed some ideas into the chair of scrutiny and the process for coming up with next year's scrutiny panels, that's kind of up to them. So, you know, thanks very much to the presenters, and thanks very much to Councillor Manro and Councillor Mahfouz and Councillor Donnelly for coming along and giving the view from their sort of respective portfolios. Can I ask that the slides from the presentations are circulated to the members? I guess that would be possible, would it? All of the presenters are happy for their slides to be circulated, are they?
Yes. Yeah, we'll do
Okay.
that.
So Sam, if you could do that would be great. Yeah, if you could do that sort of after the meeting. And I've seen Chital, I've seen Councillor.
Sorry, Chair. I was just wondering that the slides were so good. Maybe we could ask for them to be sent to all members of the council, because I think it'd be helpful for maybe them to see some of the stuff that's going on.
Yes. Okay. Why not? Yeah. Okay. I mean, would it be possible to? I guess it would be possible to do that. I don't know if it needs any authorization from anyone, but
I'll check with the head of Democratic Services, Chair, but it shouldn't be an issue. It should be fine, as long as you know, the authors of those presentations are happy for them to be shared.
Okay. Yeah. But certainly with the members of the committee, and yes, if we can circulate them more widely, yes, they may well be of interest to people. Okay, unless anyone has any last minute points they want to raise, in which case, please shout out or stick your hand up. I can't see anything. So, okay, thanks very much, everyone. So that's the end of tonight's meeting. There's another meeting in a month's time on 22nd of February, and that's discussing housing. So I look forward to seeing some of you back then. And for those of you who are just here for tonight, thanks very much for your presentations and your contributions. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.